Shabbat Shalom. As I said, this Torah portion is often very difficult for B'nai Mitzvah. And actually, 50-something years ago, United Hebrew Congregation, St. Louis, Missouri, where I grew up, where my father grew up, that he was a bar mitzvah on this weekend also. And he always reminds me how he had to find something meaningful to talk about with skin disease. And not only that, this was the height of the baby boom, so there were two other boys on the bima with him, and they all had to think about something different to say about this Torah portion that brings dread even to rabbis to talk about this Torah portion filled with skin ailments and abnormal discharges from bodily orifices. And then it tells us what our ancestors did with people with these skin ailments and abnormal discharges. They were often isolated, and there were sacrifices, and what you did with the blood of the sacrifice, and how do we find meaning from the blood and the eruptions and the oozing and the isolation and the purification. As I said, especially from this one weird disease that this week's double portion talks about, Sera, mistranslated as leprosy. It was some kind of, I don't need to get into the details. But Sera, our Torah portion tells us that it didn't only affect people's skin, it could also affect the walls of a house. Maybe Sera is some kind of general word for some kind of infection that eats away at its host, as the contemporary scholar Rabbi Rachel Adler calls the disintegration disease. So let's take a look at Sera of the walls, Sera of a house, or sometimes translated as the plague on the walls of the house. So our portion quotes God as saying, "When you enter the land of Canaan, the land of Canaan, that I give you as a possession, and I inflict Sera, I inflict this plague, upon a house in the land you possess, the owner of the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, something like a plague has appeared upon my house." So then this section goes on, and all the stuff, the furniture, whatever is in the house has to be taken out. The priest comes in and inspects the walls. The house might need to be quarantined. The walls might need to be scraped and then replastered. So our great medieval Torah commentary, Rashi, explains that God might plague this house as a means of conveying good news. For the Amorites, these ancient inhabitants of the land, they hid their gold in the house inside the walls of their houses during the 40 years that the Israelites spent in the wilderness. So I think what this tradition is saying, that the Amorites were so scared that the Israelites were going to invade that for 40 years they hid all their prized possessions in the walls of their houses. So the Sera, I'm quoting Rashi again, the Sera, this plague, would cause the new Israelite owner of the house to tear the walls down, at which point he would then find the treasure. So Rashi, our medieval commentary, didn't make up this tradition. It comes from an older rabbinic tradition that seems to say that this is God's clever way of hiding the afikomen. God wants the Israelites to enrich themselves. The Israelites need to know where to find the riches, so God shows them. But the late 18th, early 19th century Hasidic master Levi Yitzchak Berdichev has a much more spiritual gloss on this very seemingly material comment. But first, before I quote him, I have to explain a little bit about Jewish mysticism. I have to mention that everything, according to the mystics, according to what we call Kabbalah, contains the spark of the divine. even though we don't always let ourselves notice it. Let me quote the contemporary Rabbi Bradley Shavet Artson to explain. According to the early Kabbalists, in order for God to create this imperfect world, God had to withdraw into God's self, in what's known as Tzimtzum, and then God exploded energy outward, creating a material universe. At the same moment that God began to pour spiritual energy into the physical holding dock of material reality, the divine energy was so great that perfect reality shattered. There was a crack in the universe. And it is because of the crack in the universe that the physical world exists. It is the brokenness of God's creation, not its wholeness, that allows us to live. The medieval author Menachem Azaria of Fano writes, just as a seed cannot grow to perfection as long as it maintains its original form, growth coming only through decomposition, so these points cannot become perfect configurations as long as they maintain their original form, but only by breaking. There's a crack in everything. We must metaphorically peel away everything that blocks this spark to let the divine light shine. So now I go to our Hasidic master, Levi Yitzchak, who's talking about the diseased walls. The primary source of joy is when we raise up sparks to serve the Creator. When we raise up a spark, we raise up its innerness, leaving aside its externality. The outside that we throw away is the source of the eruptive plagues in the house. It is the leftover husk disconnected from the spark that rots. So when Rashi says that the eruptive plague in the house is meant as good news because of the treasures they hide, he is referring to these sparks, not to gold, not to actual treasures, but to these sparks. This is the good tiding which suggests joy, the chief joy of raising sparks. Raising these sparks is what the mystics call tikkun ha'olam, the repairing of the universe, the repairing of the world. Even in the rotting walls of the former houses of the Israelites' enemies, there are sparks of the divine. It is our job to find them and raise them up. Sparks in people who are not like us, sparks in the mundane, the seemingly grotesque, sparks in the cracked walls, sparks in our cracked, broken selves. We just have to see them. We have to make this tikkun, this repair, to bring out the sparks. As the great Canadian, the great Jew, Leonard Cohen sings, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Brokenness is beautiful because it is through brokenness that we find God, that we find these sparks. If it weren't for the Sera'at in the walls, if it weren't for this plague of the walls, our biblical ancestors wouldn't have found the treasure. Brokenness can be beautiful. When I was in rabbinical school, I had the honor of doing a summer of chaplaincy training in a hospital, actually a hospital in downtown Vancouver. And I was training to be a chaplain on the general medicine ward where there were a lot of broken people. I met with drug addicts, I met with prostitutes, I met with homeless people, I met with people who were wasting away because of AIDS. One specific man I want to talk about who was dying of a cancer related to AIDS, and he was a former drug addict. And I would come in and visit him, and he would ask me sometimes to sing him songs, sing him Hebrew songs. I even brought my guitar sometimes. And after I got to know him over the summer, I asked him, "You've had a very hard life. You're wasting away from your sickness. What gives you strength? What gives you hope? What gives you faith?" Now, he had a picture of Pope John Paul II by his bed, and he told me he wasn't a practicing Catholic, but the goodness that he learned growing up as a Catholic and embodied by this Pope as he saw gave him faith. He talked about his mother, who he had let down so many times, but the goodness in his mother gave him strength. He talked about his friends who would come and visit, who would talk about their life, who would tell him stories. That gave him hope. And he said, "It is really only now with my disease that I see how beautiful these things are." Now, God forbid to think that his disease was a punishment for his life. I'm not saying that. Or that his disease was given to him for him to learn this. I'm not saying that. But the brokenness of his life, he was able to look in and see how beautiful his life actually was, and to see how much joy there is. That taught me what it meant to be a chaplain that summer. It taught me about how broken all of us are. Again, from Rabbi Artson, "Now there are people who resist the insights born of brokenness. One of the ways we most oppress ourselves is by assuming that we alone are shattered while everyone else is whole. We tell ourselves, look at that family, how perfect they are. Look at their home, how gorgeous and clean it always is. And we assume that we are the only fractured and broken vessels struggling to make meaning in our fragmented lives. Not only do individuals try to mandate a false wholeness, but there are social forces that seek to impose the same impossible perfection on us, telling us that if we are broken, we no longer retain any utility or worth. There are entire industries in this area, blogs, magazines, and films dedicated to the self-hating proposition that we should feel fat, old, and ugly, that we should do surgery on ourselves or straighten something or bend some part or snip something or be lighter or darker, and then we'll finally have dignity, then we'll be whole. But being whole is not the point. As I taught a few minutes ago, God created the universe not to be whole. The universe is there for us to strive to make it a little wholer, a little wholer, a little wholer, and that goes for our broken selves. What the Musar masters called tikkun hanefesh, tikkun ha'olam, tikkun hanefesh, searching our souls, trying to find our brokenness, living with our brokenness, but little by little, trying to make ourselves better for others, not for self-aggrandizement, not to be perfect as Hollywood tells us to be perfect, but to make our lives better, to serve others, to be part of the community, to be part of the world. Tikkun hanefesh. We're all broken, but broken is beautiful. There's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. Now, I said our world is broken, but that doesn't mean it's not beautiful. I want to change gears just a little bit because I have to mention that this week was Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day. And Israel is not a perfect place, but it's because of these cracks that we celebrate, that we find the light, that we find the joy. And I want to read a beautiful commentary found in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper by Noah Ephron. So He's asking people who see Israel as so broken, he's talking to his fellow Israelis, what do we do on Yom HaAtzmaut? How do we celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut, he asks? By celebrating, by remembering on this day that we too often forget on other days, by remembering that in a little over 100 years, barely a scratch in history, we built from nothing, and with nothing, cities and roads and schools and factories and laboratories and concert halls and playhouses. We filled them with genius and passion and originality. By remembering that in 67 years, Israel has gathered immigrants, some broke and broken, from 100 countries, that even today most Israelis are immigrants or children of immigrants. By remembering that these people have turned soil and poured asphalt and mixed cement and written poems and made movies and composed symphonies and won Nobel Prizes. By remembering how, when a toddler enters a room in Israel, all eyes are on her. By remembering how easy Israelis smile and laugh, and how, at the start of every visit abroad, strangers seem cold and closed by comparison. An Israeli leftist, an Israeli rightist, everybody should celebrate Independence Day by remembering how much there is to celebrate on Independence Day, by remembering how successful our parents and grandparents were in building this place, and how much they left us to love in this place. These things that worry us throughout the year are real. They are reasons to despair, but there are better reasons not to. We can celebrate Independence Day by remembering how remarkable Israel is and how worthy it is to fight for. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. The world is broken. We're all broken. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Shabbat Shalom.